Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Marty from Oregon State University Press, and I'm very excited to be here tonight with Deborah Reed for the launch of her new novel, Pale Morning Light with Violet Swan, and Tina Ontiveros, author of Rough House, newly released book from Oregon State University Press. Deborah's live from her bookshop in Manzanita, Oregon, Cloud and Leaf Bookstore. And Curtis Lowe is here tonight to moderate. He's going to be asking questions of Deborah and Tina, who are both going to read from their work. I'll be here in the background. I'll be monitoring the chat window. If you have questions as the evening goes on for the authors, please put them in the chat window, and there'll be a time toward the end of the presentation. Curtis will read those questions out to the authors. Please feel free to turn your cameras on if you like, and keep your microphones off so that we can avoid various feedback noises. So with that, I'm going to turn you over to Curtis Lowe. Curtis Lowe is an independent sales rep for the Pacific Northwest and Book Travelers West. He's the head of group at Book Travelers West, and he knows both Deborah and Tina well through his work. So I think we're all in for a treat tonight. I'm going to hand it over to you, Curtis.
Thank you so much, Marty. Marty Brown, Director of Sales and Marketing Manager for Oregon State University Press. I've been working with Marty for a couple of years now, and we've been having a lot of fun, and we're having a very big month because of Tina's book, which is great. Because the numbers matter, the sales matter, and supporting independent bookstores matters. That's what my life has pretty much been dedicated to the last 30 or so. I am a publisher sales rep and an independent one, which means I work with a number of different publishers. I happen to, as of 2 weeks ago, represent not just Tina Ontiveros' publisher, Oregon State University Press, but also Mariner Books, which is an imprint of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt as of 2 weeks ago. As I said, I'm a Pacific Northwest publisher sales rep traveling to 5 states, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. And so I have known both of these people first as booksellers and secondly as authors. So Deborah Reed and Tina Ontiveros being here tonight it really is a pretty big, it's a special thing for me because they are both advocates for fine literature. And they are bold enough to be writing into a very difficult environment, but with brilliant work. That's how I know both of them. So it's an honor for me to be here. Deborah Reed owns a little bookstore called Cloud and Leaf in the coastal town of Manzanita, Oregon. It's really, truly a gem of a little bookstore that specializes in books, new books of fine literature. There are a lot of used bookstores out there, and they are fantastic, and they have such an important role to play. But just to emphasize, I do take orders for new books, recently published books, and brand new books off the press. And so that's why I have a relationship with both of these people, because Deborah does buy new books for her store. She's the author of 4 previous novels and 2 thrillers written under the pen name Audrey Braun. But tonight she's here to launch her novel, Pale Morning Light with Violet Swan by Mariner Books. It's the story of a 93-year-old accomplished but reclusive artist named Violet Swan, who lives quietly in the upper floor of her home in a seaside town, very much like Manzanita. She lives with the memory of her deceased husband, Richard, while her only son, Frank, and his wife, Penny, live below on the main floor. It's in a series of flashbacks we learn of the hard road she took from Georgia as a 14-year-old girl, crossing the country and making her way to a new life for herself in Oregon. Tina Ontiveros and I worked together for 12 years while she was the buyer at Clint's bookstore in the Dalles, Oregon. It's the longest continually operating bookstore in Oregon State. Last year, she mentioned that she had written a book, or memoir. She had a manuscript, and I was eager to read it and even more pleased at how good it was. I read a lot of manuscripts, we all do, and we wish people well, but when something really does feel this publishable, this vital a story, it was pretty exciting. She's writing about her own life as a young girl in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, where she and her family followed their logger for hire father, who's scraping out a living below the poverty line in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and a few other places too, but it's centrally there. Tina teaches writing at Columbia River Gorge Community College, and she's currently the president of the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association, and Rough House is her first book. So welcome, Deborah and Tina.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Curtis, and happy book birthday, Deborah.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Tina.
I want to say that this is a question from Marty. Marty and I we put a few questions together, but I really like this one to start off with. Both of your books feature strong women characters who transcend backgrounds of poverty and abuse. Did you set out deliberately to address issues of class and gender in your stories? Deborah?
Well, you know, when I write, I hardly ever deliberately set out to do anything, frankly. Usually what happens is I have a sense of a character and a sense of a setting and a sense of a struggle. But I can't think of a time when I've had a real intent in that way. I'm always looking for what is at the core of this person's character that troubles them the most. What have they overcome, or what are they trying to overcome? And quite often, I mean, it's a universal struggle: poverty, illness, tragedy. These are all things that all of us can relate to or have known in our lives in some form or another. You know, some of it I think does come from my very modest background that I came from. My father worked on an assembly line for Fleetwood Cadillac, and my mother worked various jobs and in the service industry. And we moved a lot when I was growing up. I went to 13 different schools in 12 years of schooling, and 11 of those were elementary. So that sense, that yearning, that onward march of where do you go next and how do you make things better, and also this sort of pie in the sky idea that somewhere out there it's bound to be better, so we'll just keep moving or we'll just keep trying. And I think that's similar to Tina's personal story as well. So when I was developing this character of Violet, I think a lot of that was, you know, subconsciously went into her struggles. But above all, I wanted her to be this, at the core, a person who is an artist and who will, no matter what happens to her in her lifetime, she's determined to overcome that in order to be this creative being that she has seen herself as since she was a young child.
All right, Tina?
I think my answer is more simple. I think yes, absolutely, 100%. I probably set out to, I'm trying to remember exactly how you phrased it, to address issues of class and gender. Yeah. I think I was just talking to a colleague today who said it to me, you know, it's so funny how you don't realize when you start, she was talking about being an academic and how everything she's doing in her academic life is a reflection of her upbringing, but she didn't know that as she took those steps along the way. And I think I thought I wanted to address issues of class and gender, but the way I ended up doing it was very different than I envisioned. But I definitely feel like as a writer, I'm always thinking about class and the ways people are marginalized, for sure.
Well, this is a good time, I think. I love that. Can we hear you each read some from your work? Deborah, would you like to start?
Sure, yeah. I'm gonna read a little bit that is it is the ending of chapter 1. So what comes before this is just that it's very early in the morning and Violet is painting as the sun is coming up, and you learn right away that she has she's been given a bad diagnosis, a bad health diagnosis. So I'll just begin there. Violet coughed into a tissue from her pocket, catching rust-colored flecks against the white. She wiped her mouth, balled the tissue, tossed it into the wastebasket, and looked west through the opposite set of windows at the curved horizon, where the sky met the ocean, blue against blue. The cool colors had a way of tempering the heat inside Violet's lungs. She swiped her tears with the back of her hand and returned to the large canvas, braced on the wall by brass hooks. She painted vertical strokes in time with the music, and moments later, traces of ordinary happiness began to sift through. The scars on her right hand appeared shinier, richer, through wet eyes and morning light. At 93 years old, nearly all of her was modeled in swirls of pink and red and honey brown of parched skin, the discolorations no longer assigned to the scars that covered her right side from shoulder to foot. Her body resembled the leaves of the variegated shrub near Francisco's work shed, which he hadn't been spending enough time in lately, always watching the evening news or staring at his phone instead of creating something new with his hands. And she would tell him this, even when something was happening. Tin cans full of brushes and pencils began to rattle, skip across the workbench, and crash to the floor. Rulers, notebooks, and masking tape plunged into easels against the wall. Violet's knees gave way beneath her. It seemed as if the house had come unmoored and was drifting out to sea. Walls trembled, floorboards heaved, and down she went, letting loose a throaty cry, "A mercy me." She was flat on her back when scenes from her past flickered like an old film, crackling in and out, in and out. Here was Richard reading her a poem, his voice so close she felt the heat of his breath on her cheek. "The world offers itself to your imagination," he whispered. "Richie," she said. But he was already gone, and in his place was a child, 7-year-old Violet, with her body set aflame. She stumbled from the burning farmhouse with her mother, catching a breath in the snow while the blaze lit the night sky. Coughing, shaking, the small bird cage clutched in her left hand. Her sister M's canary from Woolworths, warbling, whistling, alive. Wait till Em hears this song, she thought, looking down to see her charred skin thawing a circle at her feet. She was naked, her nightgown just a collar, singed and wringing her throat. The right side of her body had melted and was hardening like wax in the cold. In a flash, Violet was 14, taller than her mother, standing beneath the canvas tent of a revival, the scent of moonflowers and floodlights on every kind of person swooning across the dusty Georgia ground. Her mother dragged her by her scarred arm and delivered her to the Holy Joe on stage, who slapped Violet's soft cheeks and hissed that she repent her wicked ways. And then Violet, tromping through rugged forest in a dress and Oxford shoes, hungry, bitten, and scratching like the feral creature she had become. Another clip and spin of the reel as Richard's young face appeared on a front porch with the Pacific Ocean glinting at his back. "Who are you?" he asked. "Why are you here?" "I'm Violet Swan," she said, "and you'll know in just a minute."
Fantastic. You know, I'm going to ask you to talk about the voice in your work, and we'll have Tina read also, and then I'm going to ask her the same question after. But having heard that, with that in our ears, can you talk about what your characters' sort of self-talk says about them, the language they use, just about voice and how you got there and what it means?
Well, ever since she was a child, so she's 93 years old when the story takes place, and ever since she was a child, she saw the world through shapes and colors and space, and that has that becomes the way that she interprets the world around her. So even as she's living through tragedy upon tragedy, she transcends these things and transforms this tragedy and darkness into these beautiful creations, which is really the core of who Violet is. I think I thought of her as a little bit of a savant, because she starts drawing at a very young age, and that's all she ever wants to do and be. And so when she's looking at the world, especially the natural world, she tends to see things and view things through a very deceptively simple way of that everything sort of comes back to beauty, everything in its color, everything in its shape, even the conflicts in her family. Nothing really ruffles her. She has this harmony about her. But she's also very closed off. She's very secretive. No one in her family, no one alive that knows her knows what her story is. And so I think that is where you see her voice through the arc of the story grow larger and larger when you understand just how much she has lived. And yet here she is creating this beautiful work that evokes joy and harmony and happiness when people look at it.
It makes me think about, it felt like this duality. There are itinerant preachers that come through, and she's living in Georgia. And one of them, often they are handsy, to say the least, and actually physically abusive. But there's one of those preachers who recognizes her talent for drawing. And basically it feels like he tells her, you can talk to people this way. This is a power you have. So it's interesting that the same class of person both tried to debilitate her and use her, but also the right sort of person gave her hope that her voice and her vision would carry her through.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. Yeah, and he also becomes a bridge from one life to the other, to the one that she ends up with, and we won't give away like how that what that is, but definitely there is a moment in there where he asks her if she sees God in the room, and she says no, and he says, well, how could you? But then this is kind of where her spiritual life comes from. It's through this other way of being that sort of transcends the average person in their average life. That is where she finds her own religion, I guess, if you will.
Oh, her own religion. Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
Tina, would you like to read? I'd love to hear something from you.
Sure. You said you read the end of chapter 1, Deborah?
I did, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do that too then.
Okay.
We're going to be sisters.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see here. I don't think there's a lot of setup you need here. This is the end of chapter 1, right after my dad taught me to ride my bike in a somewhat brutal fashion. And my dad is Lloyd. After our family broke apart, Lloyd often disappeared. All my life, he had on-again, off-again relationships with Alcoholics Anonymous, the Kingdom Hall, and his children. When we did see him, it was familiar and easy. We shifted into our roles. It was like riding a bike. Our bodies remembered, so we didn't need to think about it. Sure, there was an initial awkwardness when Lloyd came back to us, but it never took long to remember how to be with my dad. Lloyd would plan ahead for our time together. He always started off with good intentions. One summer, when I was maybe 8 or 9, he had some bikes waiting for us. He'd borrowed them from a buddy whose kids had outgrown them. We got to keep them the entire time we stayed with Lloyd. He wanted to ride bikes all summer because he'd bought himself a bicycle, and it was his new love. It wasn't new, but it was new to Lloyd. He was ridiculously proud of this bike. It was old, but he had fixed it up and polished it to a shine. Looking back, I can see how the bike, like his garden, had something to do with the way his body seemed to need work. My dad always had to be striving in some way. When he lived in less traditional shelters, as he often did, the daily business of living, basic survival, was physical work. He always needed to repair, reinforce, and patch up the rustic shelters he built. This particular summer, the summer with Lloyd's beloved bike, he was renting a tidy little farmhouse in a sparsely populated neighborhood on the edge of Yakima. The house rarely needed his attention, but he had a huge garden to tend, and he was always fiddling with that bike. It had wide handlebars gleaming in the sun with red and white plastic tassels at the ends and a cream-colored banana seat. It came with an old-fashioned silver bicycle bell, and Lloyd had added his own noisemaker, one of those horns with a red bulb on the end that makes a honk like a clown's nose. This was the BMX era, so Jesse and I thought the whole thing was silly and outdated. It looked like a giant child's bike, so it fit Lloyd for sure. He was childlike, irrepressible, and bursting with energy in moments of joy or anger. The thing with Lloyd is you could always see everything in his face. He didn't hide his feelings, good or bad. And when he rode that bike up and down the street, he just beamed out at the world. He'd cruise along, honking his horn, ringing his bell, and hollering at us because everything seemed funny and needed to be shared. If my stepmom Linda came out while he was riding by, he might yell, "Hubba, hubba," or mimic Hank Williams as he sang out the chorus to "Hey, Good Lookin'." If he happened to ride near us at the right moment, he'd lift up one butt cheek to an exaggerated height and let loose a fart in our direction. Half the time I didn't even feel like riding bikes, but I always went along anyway just to be with Lloyd and see how his face would light up. I was taking something away from that bike ride that had nothing to do with riding bikes. I have a scar on my shin that I've always clung to as evidence of my first bike riding lesson with Lloyd. Truth is, that scar could have come from some other fall. That memory, like so many, is unreliable. I can't say for sure what town we lived in when he taught me to ride a bike. Just like I can't be sure we were in Yakima the summer he had his vintage bike with the clown horn. Jesse can't say either, though he thinks I learned to ride a bike in Randall. Mom isn't sure if I learned before she left Lloyd or after. It's difficult to place memories in a childhood of migrations. This is what it was like to be Lloyd's daughter. I was always collecting evidence, memorizing moments, eavesdropping on stories, trying to hold on to what happened, when, and how. Proof that I had a dad and that he was funny and silly and I was important to him. Sometimes my imagination filled in the blank spots. When I stand in the bike memory, I feel the aura of Lloyd's place in Yakima, but that doesn't fit because I was too old that summer. I already knew how to ride a bike by then. Maybe he taught me in Clallam Bay, Morton, CQ. Lloyd was a drifter. We rarely lived in the same place twice. When I was with my dad, my stories always had different settings, so my mind sometimes puts me on that bike in different towns, Lloyd running beside me on different streets. The truth of this story, like so many things about my dad, is lost to me. Maybe that's why I need to set him down on paper, keep him from disappearing altogether, because sometimes it feels like he never existed at all, like I made him up entirely. But I didn't make Lloyd, he made me. That day on the bike is just one of the ways he made me. For many years, I'd think of that bike riding lesson and only see my bloody knee, only feel the purple indents left on the palms of my hands by gravel. I'd taste sweat and tears and snot and the acid of my anger. Now I wonder, how did I manage to forget the power I felt when I first rode that bike? Nothing in this story was mine, not the bike, the neighborhood, the friends, the house. Sometimes, most of the time, not even the dad. They'd all be lost to poverty, addiction, and Lloyd's migrations. But I had this new ability and it belonged to me. It was only mine. I could ride a bike. Why did I let myself forget the freedom and the flying?
Thank you so much for that. So let's talk about voice in your work also. How did you make those choices? Why that voice?
For me, my dad was not highly literate. And he would often tell me, "Oh, honey, I'm not book smart like you are." And he definitely, as I grew older, what he considered book smarts was a thing that came between us. And so when I decided to write this book about him, I really wanted, at least for the first half, when the character of Tina is a child who's growing up and the only world she knows is Lloyd's, I wanted it to sort of have his voice and to be very approachable to him. I wanted it to be something he could read if he were alive and wanted to, and he would feel welcomed in. He wouldn't feel, I think often language is used as sort of a gatekeeping device. And I just wanted it to be very, like, I just wanted it to be open to my dad. I think Jenny's on this call. And I remember the other day, she said, it's just so approachable. And that was what I was going for. Just kind of a very approachable voice. I was a code switcher as a kid, whenever I went back to my dad's, I would say ain't, and I would drop my G's, and I knew that made him feel more comfortable. And when I was too formal in my speech, he would, sort of joke about me getting above my upbringing, but it was really him sort of expressing how it made him feel unsure of himself, So I definitely wanted that voice to be, I don't know, it was sort of a tribute to him. And I think also there's a part of me that really wants to wants to rebel against assimilation and the need to assimilate and lose so much about the speech that you grow up with when you do become educated and maybe financially stable. So definitely intentional.
You know, there's so much movement in both of your stories. Your characters cover a lot of ground. There's this westward movement. It's so often represented sort of freedom. Tina, your book, it's the Pacific Northwest sort of going round and round, searching for something, while Violet is escaping something to find sort of a new home. So where they live, any of us, what are the core concerns in our lives? It's where are we going to lay our head tonight? Where are we going to sleep? Children worry, adults worry. And so many people do right now with the fires in Oregon and COVID and people losing their homes. So I think we may just see a new kind of migration in this country. We're seeing people move. We're seeing people who have means, they're moving to places where because they can work remotely. Other people are losing their homes. Some people are living in their vehicles. But when it comes to that theme of migration, Deborah, your character's on the move. What does that mean to Violet? What is she doing when she sets out and leaves Georgia and all of the fascinating places she goes?
Yeah, so she leaves Georgia, which, by the way, is where my father is from. She leaves Georgia, and she is completely focused on arriving in the Pacific Northwest. And it's almost like, because she's been told about it by this one traveling preacher, it's become this sort of a fantasy in her mind of a place that she is going to reach. And she just has the sense about it because the way that he described it to her, the colors, the cliffs, the ocean, the movement, the innate beauty, it suited her. And she travels across the country and is determined to find this kind of a utopia for herself. And eventually she does. I think, going back to what I was saying before, I'm sure that a part of that comes from my own sense of finding a home in the Pacific Northwest. After having lived in many, many places in my lifetime, I've lived in Oregon longer than I've lived anywhere. And Manzanita in particular feels more like home than anything has ever felt for me. And so it was very easy to evoke that for Violet, to finally find a home to land in, and a place where you feel comfortable enough to create art. And that what you're saying about people moving and migrating, when that's happening here, we're seeing that in Manzanita. People are deciding to go ahead and live in their second homes that they had. They're selling their other homes, or they're just, moving here from wherever. Everyone is kind of reassessing they're taking stock. And there's a lot of that in my book as well. This feeling of taking stock of what is important, and why are you living the life that you're living, and how did you make these choices? But it's the age-old story of the journey, isn't it? And going west,
Yeah,
or making west, as it was with Tina, being in the west and going in a circle.
Yeah, right. Well, I love that. And the home is such a character. Certainly the place of Manzanita and the Oregon coast is a sort of a character, but that home that we're introduced to right away, and that she lives in this upper floor, and you tell us about the light and her implements, the tools of her art, at the same time that she's hearing partial conversations of her only son, who is in his 60s now, and his wife, who are having there's trouble, but as in life, you never quite get the full picture. You just hear little bits and pieces of that story. Something's wrong. And even as, everybody thinks, well, you're going to make it. At 93, you've made it. You're financially stable, everything else. But then there's actually a Tembler. right? I mean,
Yeah.
that is when she loses balance, that is because there is an earthquake, and it brings people heavy enough to do some pretty serious damage, but not so bad that they can't go back and live in their home. And so they have to go out and sort of assess. It's that before and after. And so what are the things that where you start talking about before and after this moment? So it's really emphasized in your book that this is before and after that earthquake. Everything before that earthquake is the whole story of Violet's life that she is going to reveal over time. I just think it's a beautiful metaphor. It works so beautifully, and your setting is fantastic.
Thank you.
So, Tina, I have the same question about migration, movement, and home, defining home in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this book, definitely the first part of the book is focused on the years that we were migrating to follow work. So home was just wherever my parents were. You know, a lot of the times we were pulling a very small trailer around behind us that we lived in, but sometimes we would live in like, you know, logging cabins. Sometimes we would live in, you know, little one-room studios that we would rent. Most of the time we were in a small trailer that we hauled around behind us. And then when my parents split, a lot of that has to do with my mom wanting to settle down, wanting a single home. And that being something that Lloyd finally gave her, but it didn't suit him. Migration, he was like a feral thing with a territory, and he was always moving around in that territory. And so his violence sort of escalated when we tried settling down. And so that's why my mom ended up leaving. And then she settled and stayed in one place. And then he continued to move. And like you were just showing the trailer on the front of I didn't actually live in that trailer. People ask me that a lot. But when we were, you know, when OSU was designing the cover and kept showing me comps, I always shared them with my brother, because there's no time I was ever with Lloyd that my brother wasn't with me. And when we saw that one, we were both like, oh my gosh. Like I said, if Dad saw that, he would see an opportunity. And my brother said he'd be like, kids, we're home. Because he would find something like that and clean it up and turn it into our house. And if he was staying put for a while, he would often like build a shack off the side of it and make this whole, even if we weren't staying a while, sometimes he would build these elaborate encampments that we just, you know, left. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I answer your question, Curtis, but I think migration was just Lloyd was kind of feral. It was in his, and plus he was sick, you know, he was an addict, and he burned bridges a lot. So he moved on. And while he's kind of cycled through some towns more than once, because he would cycle through anywhere where his brother or sister was. But he just sort of roamed. That was what he did.
You know, the structure in both of your work is so different, but I'm always fascinated by internal storytelling, like how characters talk about themselves and how they talk about the other people and what they know about them. I guess I would ask Deborah about time, memory, and storytelling work inside your novel.
Yeah, I think in all of my work, I have a fascination with this idea that we all are certain that we're right. And we can't all be right at the same time. And so I love dipping in and out of the points of views of each character with the same subject matter overlapping, so that we can see how one person views a situation and a relationship, and they do seem like they're right about it, and then we see the other person's, and they do also, because you're seeing it from inside their heads, and that's always fascinated me. And so I think in most all of my books, I have a structure where I dip in and out. I give characters their own chapters, their own points of view. And everybody always misunderstands each other. And I think that is just a reflection of real life. It's interesting how we miss the cues, and we misread each other, or we assume the worst, we don't spend enough time considering what someone actually said or did, and we get our feelings hurt, and all of these things. The potential for things to go wrong in relationships at any given moment is so high. I think it's a miracle that any of us ever get along and have a relationship at all. So I love playing around with that, jumping in and out of point of view, and showing how well two people could be right even at opposite ends. And also, I think, especially right now, we live in such a polarized culture that it is impossible to get out of our own point of view. We've decided that we're just going to stop, and it's become increasingly difficult to see how someone else could be different, but also have a really good point, and you could understand how, from their perspective, they would think that something is right, or their feelings are hurt, or whatever the case might be. But
one of the characteristics of your characters, though, is that they do seem to really pay attention to each other, and they take in new information and actually incorporate it. Sometimes that new information is kind of undeniable in that it is in the form of a person. An act resulted in a baby, right? And so you have to make something of that. I think we live in a culture right now where people are denying the truth in front of them so much. I guess I find your book very satisfying, partly because they are misunderstanding each other, but it's not for lack of trying. And some of your characters are so overwhelmed by their own sort of troubles that it's hard for them to focus, but eventually they try. It seems like a lot of well-intentioned people in your work.
yeah, and I think I feel that way in general about life and other humans, that most of us truly are well-intentioned. And I don't, I like to develop that in characters. I like to have a lot of empathy and sympathy for my characters. Of course, there's a lot of conflict in there too, but I enjoy reading novels where the characters they're full of faults, but we just love them. We just, there's a strong sense of empathy and acceptance for all of the ways in which they've done someone else wrong. One of the themes in my book is the relationship between parents and children, and parents and grandparents and grandchildren, and how it tends to be in life that grandparents have a much less complicated and truly genuinely beautiful relationship with their grandchildren. It just skips over. It doesn't come with all the baggage of having raised your own children. And that's another thing that I wanted to address in this book, was that strange way that grandparents and grandchildren can absolutely, it's its own kind of love. Mm. And I think it's an important love, that if kids are lucky enough to get it, I think they're lucky. I mean, they're just lucky. Yeah. I think it serves children well to have that unconditional love that grandparents offer.
Yeah, I love the way that you explore those relationships. And speaking of love, I think, Tina, sometimes in Rough House, people know there are hard things happening in this book. But I have noticed you are rewriting the story of Lloyd, even as he tried to convince you of who he was. He was a great storyteller, was he not? So the way that he tried to talk about himself, I'm fascinated by that. I'm also fascinated by your promotion of him. You loved him so much, and he had many good qualities. And he also hurt you and hurt others around him. But can you talk about the way Lloyd would tell stories inside Rough House?
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely connected when Deborah was talking about characters who are full of faults and we love them anyway. It was a big part of my process. Was I sort of challenged myself to write memoir, because I thought, how interesting and difficult would it be to try to use the tools of fiction to write a story that's true. and it really is. It's a lot of making. People often ask about it as if it's just me standing in a room talking about my life, but it's so much work. It's so much making. Like you asked a minute ago about how memory and time work. Well, to me, they were devices like anything else. They're tools that I'm using to make this thing that people will experience. But as far as Lloyd and his storytelling, you know, he wasn't a big reader. He didn't read to us, but he definitely told us a lot of stories, and he was kind of a myth maker. Like his stories were always about me or my brother or him. And he was always kind of larger than life, and a lot of logging adventures and things that he would do. But I definitely, when I was a child, I had this way of seeing Lloyd. His world was full of adventure and sort of storybook elements. We were always in the forest. And it was just always these lush, beautiful settings. And he made everything an adventure. He'd take us on walks and just sort of invite us to explore nature and just sort of spend time with us in a way that I think is unusual for parents in any class, you know, and it was truly a gift. So despite all of the ways he would hurt us, he also taught us to expect love from the world and to give the world love. And, but part of his story making was that he would, part of that storybook sort of feel for me was that I used to imagine him as when he would become violent, I would imagine him as like a werewolf, right? Because I needed in my child's mind to understand how he could be that man that takes me and walks me on the beach and has endless patience, and could also be this violent person who hurts us. And so I always kind of thought of him as this sort of having this transformation where something monstrous sort of took him over. And when that happened, it wasn't my dad anymore. And his storytelling, which was one of my favorite things about him. And like I said, when he told stories about us, it was like we were the best kids in the whole world. Like I think his storytelling really instilled in me a sense of worth. But it also was another wedge between us, because I began to notice the older I got that in my brain, this wolf was committing these acts of violence, but Lloyd would later tell the story, and he would always, he would tell those stories and sort of change them just a little bit and try to turn them from, you know, what I felt as were terrifying or scary into something more acceptable and kind of funny. He would try to make it sort of slapstick. And you know, he wouldn't retell the story of a very violent episode, but he would retell stories of these inappropriate moments where his anger took him over. Like there was a time when I was a child and I was a toddler and I asked for more pudding after I'd finished my pudding. And he thought he needed to teach me a lesson about being selfish. And so he gave me his pudding, but he put it on my face and he held it over my face. And I just remember my whole family holding their breath, because it's like, is this going to turn into one of his episodes where things get really, really, really bad? And it didn't. But then he would retell that story. And when he told the story, it was like, it was funny. It was comedy. And so the older I got, the more I thought, well, if the wolf is the one who's hurting me, why is Lloyd the one telling the stories? You know, and so it was also kind of a way that sort of started to put a crack in the veneer for me.
Wow.
Fantastic. Love it. And speaking of stories, both of you are in the business of your purveyors of stories. How does owning, well, you own Deborah, but you've both had extensive experience, obviously, as readers, but also now in curating bookstores with limited space, as any physical store does have, and making choices for that store. How does that influence the way you see yourself in the world and your writing? Deborah?
Well, when I was finishing up this book, that was the same time that I was purchasing the bookstore. And so I was still in the process of writing that book. And the bookstore made its way into the novel. So it's almost like I was, I put it in there and it was helping me go through the motions of becoming a bookstore owner by writing about a bookstore owner. And so once I handed in the book, I literally the very next day took over this bookstore. That was 1.5 years ago. And so I haven't been able to do a lot of writing is the thing since.
Well, you weren't actually. The first time I met you, your wrist was in a cast. And so Quincy also hurts. Doesn't she hurt her arm?
She hurt her foot, yeah.
Foot. That's right, foot. But anyway, you were in a cast and trying to figure out like how you were going to do this, because you're not only trying to write, but you were managing your own inventory in your store and taking this over. It just, you've gone through your own little earthquake.
One of the, that was a whole other debacle of tripping over the dog leash and all these things that happened. But having recovered from that, I will say that, this bookstore, I mean, every independent bookstore, and this is one of the things that is just so delightful about independent bookstores, is that they all have their own personality. They all are a reflection of the community that you find them in. And because we're in a sleepy little, more or less, village, there's hardly any commerce here. There's hardly, we don't have like hotels or, the lodging is limited and small. People come here to unwind and disconnect from the internet. And so the majority of the books that I sell are literary fiction and poetry and really high quality nonfiction. It's remarkable because you think, oh, people go to the beach and they want, just like a beach read, or, I do sell mysteries, but even in the middle of summer, when I look at my sales report each week and I see what books have left my store and are in the hands of readers, including books that parents are reading to their children. So many parents are reading to their children. So many children are reading. The most wonderful novels and books of poetry and profound and meaningful books on science and nature, they're all going out of the store every week. And it renews my faith in humanity every week. In spite of what I see in the news and everything else going on, I feel like I have this little secret insight into, okay, but they took these books into their homes and they're reading these. This is also happening. And I feel honored that I can play a role in that I get to curate and choose what I carry in this store and what I can talk about with readers and offer up to them. And it is so satisfying to have someone come back into the store and say, I love that book that you read. What else should I read? And it's just an incredible feeling. You feel like you're making a difference. You're reaching people in their, not just in their minds, but in their hearts.
Wonderful, Deborah. Thank you. And Tina?
Yeah, I'm with Deborah as far as just that day-to-day experience of book selling and how it constantly reaffirms your faith in humanity. But I think as far as your question about how books, I think you asked how book selling like influenced our writing.
Well, how do you think about being an author? Yeah.
To be honest, it made me very reluctant to even try to publish.
I remember you telling me that. You were like, oh. Gosh,
I thought when you first asked that, I scanned the Zoom for Tom but it looks like he's left. He was here earlier because I remember that he told me to send him his manuscript and I didn't do it.
Yeah,
and then to send me and because if there's anything I learned from all my years book selling, it's that there are so many amazing, beautiful books in the world, and there are so many people trying to have their voices heard. And I just felt like, oh, Tina, don't make noise. You know what I mean? So I think it sort of made me feel like there's just so many great books already. Like it was definitely something that made me think twice about publishing.
Yeah,
it's daunting. It's very daunting.
Yeah. Oh, I can't imagine. I just can't imagine. That's why I love promoting books that I love and books that other people love. But yeah, the writing, I just am so glad that both of you are writing. I see a question here. We're getting close to the end of the hour, but there's a question here from VJ, a question for both of you. I really appreciate both of your works exploring the complicated ways that love and hurt can be cyclical or come from the same source. This kind of humanization of difficult antagonistic themes, is this something that surprised you as you revised your work or something you knew would emerge? An easy one.
Hmm.
I mean, that's definitely one that is at the heart of Rough House for me. Was humanizing the difficult. That's huge. I think when you grow up poor in this country, there's a way that you are villainized. If you grow up in any marginalized population, I'm sure it's the same. But there's a way that you feel responsible for the ways your family is always wanting. And there's a way that that I grew up feeling like, you know, our speech was ugly and there was something wrong with us. And that's why we didn't have money or a social network, you know? And so it was important to me that I not just show the hard parts of my dad, because that wasn't the whole truth of him. That humanization was a lot of work, and it was what I really set out to do, is like, could I list these terrible things he did? Because he did do some terrible things. He was sick and he didn't have help getting better. Could I list these terrible things he did and still make him lovable to the reader? Because that's how he was to us. He was very, very lovable. But yeah, I think it's a really, really good, very well-worded question, that cyclical sense, and the way that that love and hurt kind of come in cycles from the same source is, I think, a very big part of the human experience.
Yeah, I agree. It reminds me of this essay by Nick Cave about the sad song, why the sad song is so profound and so meaningful. And I think, you know, we get these holes blasted out of us through tragic events, through sorrow. And if, in particular, for people who are creative, you fill it with something. You fill it with an expression, with a creative act that really can only come from that place. I mean, it exists because of that hole. I think Nick Cave said something like that, you know, we have a need to create, and sorrow is a creative act. And I couldn't, you know, that I think that that's certainly true for me. All of the pain and sorrow and grief that I have felt in my lifetime, I feel like it's created these holes that I dip into, and that's where you find this beauty and the good stuff and the love that you offer up, whether it's to another person or a creative act. But I do think that they come from the same source, strangely.
That is just beautiful. Wow, what a great question and fantastic answers. Now I have one question for each of you, one for Deborah and then one for Tina. The first one for Deborah comes from Beth Branco. This is a question for Deborah Reed. I noticed when you read the end of the first chapter, a quote from Mary Oliver's poem, Wild Geese. Does this poem have any significance to the story?
It does. It does. It's the poem comes back again. It's so her husband used to read poetry to her, and he's been dead for 20 years when the story begins. And when she has this fall during the earthquake and she hears him whisper in her ear, what he whispers is a line from Mary Oliver's poem. And that same poem comes back in the story later, coincidentally in the bookstore. It's sort of a thread that pulls throughout the story. And in fact, the store, Cloud and Leaf, is named after a Mary Oliver poem, The Cloud and the Leaf, or The Leaf and the Cloud, a very long poem that she wrote, which is an entire book. So yeah, I'm a huge Mary Oliver fan, and so I was just soothing myself by putting in a couple of lines of her poetry in my own book, which yeah.
I think a lot of readers find that soothing too. So many people connect to that beautiful work. I have one question for you, and then we'll wrap it up after this. But Tina, there's a question from Avi Stacy. Is there anything that didn't make it into the book, either due to editing or being remembered too late, that bothers you?
I wouldn't say anything that bothers me. I've learned some new things since the book sort of went to press, and most notably, there's a significant person in the book who I'm honest in the book about the fact that I don't know whatever became of that person. It would seem like somebody I should still have a close relationship with, but my dad, the way he lived his life, he would disappear for long periods at a time, and then emerge again. And so I did kind of find out that person's fate since the book published, but I wouldn't say anything I regret, and definitely not due to editing, because I love edit. Like, anything anyone ever tells me should be cut, I cut. I'm sort of a voracious reviser, and I probably had 500 pages for this book.
Wow.
I cut more than I published, and I don't know why cutting just scratches an itch for me. I really wanted to be very conscious of the reader's time, and so I cut a lot out. And anytime a reader, I had a couple people that really worked with me on the book before my publishing editor, and any one of them who made suggestions about cutting, I just did it. Like, I think Marty, who's here right now, made a couple suggestions. I'm like, okay, you don't have to explain it, I'll just cut it, because it is a made thing, and I want I'm conscious of the reader's experience. And so if I can see that suggestion working, I cut it. But I have learned some cool, interesting stories since it went to press that might have been nice to put in there. I just didn't know them at the time.
And I know you have more coming. So, thanks to both of you for being here tonight. This has been really such a gift to me. I know that nobody's left, that tells you something. Support your independent bookstores. These are two people who come from the independent book world, and they're there to serve you. I think that I imagine, I do a lot of traveling, but I can imagine a trip from Clint's to Wacoma to cover the beautiful stores in Portland, then go over to Time Enough Books in El Waco, and then just start going south on one and get to Lucy's Books in Astoria, Godfather's Books in Astoria, keep going down to Beach Books in Seaside, Cannon Beach Books in Cannon Beach, and then you're going to be at Cloud and Leaf in Manzanita, and then you just keep going down Lincoln City, Bob's Beach Books. There's a lot to discover. Each store is unique. And thank you for all that you do for independent bookstores and the writing life and our imaginative life. And thank you, Marty, for hosting this tonight.
Thank you, Curtis, for moderating. Thank you, Tina, for joining us. And Deborah, thank you for letting us help you celebrate the launch.
Thank you.
Your wonderful new novel.
It was my pleasure, truly. It's almost like I had you in my store tonight. Thank you.
We felt like we were in it a little bit. Yeah, it's a beautiful place. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone, have a good evening.
Happy launch, Deborah.
Thank you, Tina.